Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Coast to Coast Combat Hour. I'm your host, Matthew Hawkins, along with my co-host, Ed Carbajal. And on a weekly basis, we plan to bring you the biggest news and interviews in the world of combat sports. Ed, how you doing, brother?
Freezing in Jersey. How are you?
Good. You just had a warm-up a couple days ago, didn't you?
Yeah, it didn't last long.
All right. Well, from sunny Florida, the Orlando area, we're lucky to have with us Ray Robles, black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu from the 6th Level Academy in the Orlando area. Ray, how you doing?
What's going on, guys? Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us. For those that don't know, Ray has been one of our biggest supporters. We all kind of got together through the MMAcommunity.com forum. And as I started my writing and when he heard about this podcast, he's been basically one of our #1 supporters. So we wanted to bring him on, talk about some Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, add another aspect to our combat talk. And I'm going to kind of hand it over to Ed, being that he's a black belt as well. And I'm sure he has some big questions for Ray.
Well, yeah, I mean, Ray has had the pleasure of spending the most time with a lot of people that, with one of the people that many MMA fans know the art of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu from. He was sharing with us a story about Royce Gracie. So can you just talk about your experience? I know you said you started with Din Thomas, but how did you and Royce first come together to do it? Because you guys do seminars together and stuff now, right?
Well, no, he comes to our gym. So I started training in '99 with Dean Thomas, my ex-roommate years back at a time in Orlando. Is like, he knew, like, I watched UFC. I remember watching all that stuff back in the day and wanted to get into learning like MMA or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but there wasn't really an area around. My ex-roommate at the time worked at a nightclub, and he's like, "Hey man, one of these guys who's a bouncer there, he's a small guy, but he fights in that UFC and that MMA stuff." And I was like, "Who is it?" He's like, "This guy named Dean. You got to meet him." So I met Dean, and he owned a gym at the time called United Champions. Went down there, met him, super cool guy. I met him right before he fought Jens Pulver. And he caught Jens in that heel hook, and I was like, "Man, that's awesome. You got to, show me that." So started training with Dean for a little bit, and he left to go down to South Florida to go open up a American top team with like Conan and a bunch of the other guys. And when he left down to South Florida, I stayed in the Orlando area. After that point, I jumped around the country. I was involved in other things that kept my interest in life, music and other stuff. So I went out to LA for a bit and traveled around different places, and I met other instructors and trainers. When I finally came back to Orlando, circa 2005, I was looking for a school to train. And just driving, through, the neighborhoods in the area, I saw Royce Gracie JiuJitsu Academy. And I was like, Royce Gracie JiuJitsu Academy, what's this? And it said like Royce Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. And I was like, dude, that like Royce is the man. He lives in Florida. I had no idea if he lived here or not. Yeah. So I stopped in there, and then I met this gentleman named Jonathan Burke. And John is still now my coach now, but John was one of Royce's first black belts. And, he told me the story about Royce and everything like that. He's like, "Man, you got to start training." Royce comes here. John came up with the Gracie Academy. So I started training with John. Still to this day, I'm training with John. But I met him there. And probably it was shortly after the Matt Hughes fight. So it was probably 4 or 5 months after I started training with John. Royce came to our gym to do a seminar. Met Royce there for the first time. Super cool guy, and I was really honored because that day he knew John told him I trained prior, and I had many years of training prior to that point. So Royce met me, and he's like, "You know what?" He's like, he promoted me to blue belt that day. Actually, the next day I did a private lesson with him, and it was really awesome. So from that point on, since 2006, I've been training with John at the academy, and annually Royce would come by, a couple times a year to do seminars and stuff. And throughout the time I've met him and stuff, and I've been real honored to meet him, train under him, and which was really cool. And John tells me all the great stories of the old Gracie Academy, how they came up and everything like that. So it's just been a good lineage that I'm proud. I know I'm very proud of my lineage from John through Royce and stuff like that, because I know it's like that jiu-jitsu right from like the founding fathers, the creators of the art. So I'm really honored and privileged about that.
Yeah, that's fortunate too, man, because it's hard to, nowadays. So you started in '99. I started like maybe 3 or 4 years after you. And even back then, finding a good jiu-jitsu school was hard.
Yeah.
You had to, if you were driving an hour to get to a place, that was considered good. Now there's almost one on every corner. So it's like the evolution of that martial art, along with the sport of mixed martial arts. It's flourished for obviously for entertainment, for businesses. I mean, people, even karate schools, taekwondo schools, and stuff have adapted a jiu-jitsu program into their schools because they had to recognize the not just the value of the martial art as a self-defense tool, but the overall, recognizing it as a legitimate adaptation to any martial art. Up here, we had Hoyler was the guy up in my area, New Jersey.
Cool.
He brought jiu-jitsu to Jersey, and that was one of the things. And one of his first black belts, Lou Vintalaro, who was my instructor's original instructor, he said that on his website he said that he's like, if you train in other martial arts, this is a perfect way to supplement your training. And it seems like it was whatever was a supplement stole anyone, because I was an Isshinryu karate guy. And then I did Isshinryu karate for 11 years. I did kickboxing before that, stick fighting, aikido. I did all this stuff. And then when I found jiu-jitsu, that's all I do now. I mean, that's all I do now. So it's definitely, I mean, the fact that you have that Royce connection, that's really something to brag about, man. Congrats, man. It's
funny because, like, there's a stigma about the Gracies in the jiu-jitsu community or in the MMA community, actually, sometimes. And I find it funny because no matter what fighter is out there modernly, you see a lot of the fan base, people who don't train will often, like, have sort of a backlash toward the Gracies for multiple reasons, and everybody's entitled to their opinion. But when you start looking at the fighters, the top fighters in the world nowadays, the Conor McGregors, the Nate Diaz's, all those guys, everybody will still turn around and be like, wow, if it wasn't for the Gracies and Royce and that thing, what they did, what he did coming out of the original UFC, we wouldn't be here today. And I think it's like when you pay tribute to the founding fathers, if you will, in MMA and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the Gracies, you find that, like, no matter what's out there, things are always going to change. There's always going to be an evolution of the process of how people do things. But to go back and look back and have that connection to the source, I do find that's very it's important. I'm proud, like I said, I'm proud of that lineage, and I know there's many people around the world that have that lineage as well too, and that's awesome. So I always encourage people, you get the closer to the source you get, the more proficient you're going to be at the art. So
yeah, when I first, I had some early training. I got into it kind of in the mid 90s. I remember I actually drove up to the Gracie Academy in Torrance, me and one of my buddies, when I think I was a senior in high school. And it was just to kind of go up there, and, it was about 2.5 hour drive from my house. And I even questioned, at the time, like Ed was saying, there wasn't gyms anywhere. So it was almost like, do I drive 2.5 hours a couple times a week just to be able to experience this? But just to be able to go up there and see everything on the wall. And I think they even had the little statue of the octagon, the original octagon. I bought my Gracie in Action VHS tapes for about $75 a pop. And came and watched those, and I was able to get in with Mark Hall, who was also one of the early pioneers of
nice
UFC 7. Trained with him for a couple years, and got to train with some other guys. Richard Red Herd, he won the original World Valley Tudo Championship tournament. So it was just kind of cool being a fan and getting, I was a huge Royce Gracie fan. I mean, without Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, that was my first love getting into it. I trained with Rick Lucero, who at the time was a brand belt under Joe Moreira, and a guy named John Munoz, who's actually has his own academy now here in Ontario, California.
What the funny thing about it is, and Ray, you can jump in on this. One of the reactions that when I get that reaction where people try to like say, oh, but the Gracies, it's old school, whatever. When they try to say something negative, I'm like, you guys realize they're fighting with no rules, right? Like, I always have to point out that, like, what they're doing now is a watered down version of a real fight or the closest thing to a real fight that you can get. And that's usually when I say that, they're like, oh, there was no rule. It's either they didn't know that the original UFC didn't have any rules, or they just forgot, and they're like, oh yeah, that's true too. And then the conversation's usually over there.
And that's the big thing. A lot of people don't get that. Like, modernly, you're never going to see a 170-pound athlete fight a 350-pound man, and everybody's going to be like, yeah, we're cool with that. Make it happen. It really was different. And I know a lot of people come back and say, oh, but if you took a George St. Pierre and you put him in that period, or if you took a Conor or somebody put him in that period, yeah, no kidding, they'd be great, because they're now the evolution of what the athlete is. The same way we look at, LeBron James could, beat Jerry West in a basketball game, even though Jerry West was phenomenal back in the 70s or 60s. It's that same concept. Like, I think that when you look at what MMA was coming from that, basically, guys, it's a street fight in a cage, and we're picking style versus style to see whose style is the best. And the evolution of it became that, we realized that Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was phenomenal. So we need to implement that into my striking training and my wrestling training to get a better, well-rounded athlete. And that's where it all came from. So when it always gets me when I see that pushback against the Gracies, because people have their opinions about, their egos and their arrogance. But like, I always tell people, like anybody, if you were defending your family name, you put your name, your brand on something, your family name on something, I think people would probably also be a little bit more protective of how that's perceived or how it's put out there if anyone's trash talking it or anything. So if they've got upset by some things that people have said, I think they're kind of entitled to it, because truth be told, 1925 till now, they put in the time to develop it, that even modernly, if you look at all the top jiu-jitsu competitors today, they've all come from a lineage of a Gracie. Whether it's on Carlos' side or Elio's side, they've come from a lineage directly they could trace back. Nicky Ryan, everybody's talking about him after this weekend's phenomenal Kasai event up there in Brooklyn. Yeah. And I mean, Nicky's great, 16 years old, beating black belts. I mean, he's phenomenal. But he's with Tom DeBlas, who's Henzo, who comes right there from the lineage. It's a direct lineage to the source. And guys will implement new styles and different things to try and do, but it all comes from their base understanding of the source that comes from the Gracies and those forefathers beforehand. That's why it's important to kind of always look back to be like, all right, this is where we come from, and this is where we are now because of them. So
what do you think? What do you think about talking about the starting or the roots of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? What do you think? Because I know Hickson kind of with the new self-defense thing. I mean, it's like there's this argument now from like older. I consider myself an old jiu-jitsu guy because I'm old. But what do you think about the argument about how sport? The same thing with MMA. We just talked about how MMA it came from this no holds barred fighting that Royce Gracie fought in the UFC 1. What do you think about the argument that they're talking about how sport jiu-jitsu versus the original jiu-jitsu for self-defense, and how all these competitions are watering down the sport? I mean, competition is good for improvement and challenging yourself and stuff, but as far as like all the rule sets and all the inverted stuff and the fancy stuff that you wouldn't try flying anything in the street. You know what I mean? So like, what's your opinion on it?
Well, if you look at modernly in the big trend right now in sport jiu-jitsu is no-gi submission grappling, submission only grappling, I should say, and leg locks. And never will you ever see you ever should go for a heel hook or a leg lock in the street, because I remember one of my good friends, a fighter out of here, one of the coaches here, Ryan Keenan, one of his last MMA fights, the guy in a cage went down for a heel hook on him. And Ryan just kind of like looked at him, spun, hit him with a spinning back fist and beat him up. And his coaches, the other guys' coaches are like, oh, like encouraging him to go for the leg still. And I'm like, why would you do that in a fight? I do have the theory of this. Listen, to each everything, there is a place for everything. For those who are only about the self-defense aspect of jiu-jitsu, my personal opinion, now this might differ from my coach or from other people, my personal opinion is this, and you coming from an old school as well, if you say we're only about the self-defense and you teach guard passing or triangle choke defense, my comeback to that is, how many people on the street are pulling guard on you or attacking triangles that you feel the need that it's important to teach them how to defend that? So there is an aspect of competitiveness that you have in jiu-jitsu that you're saying that if you're allowing yourself to teach how to defend these things, then you're saying you're making it a competition against skilled jiu-jitsu competitors. So therefore, allow the art to develop in a sport aspect. Allow it to, and if people are coming up with different things, it's just riffing on the original theme. On the flip side of it, when I look at guys who come from heavy competition-based schools and don't know how to teach self-defense or don't practice the self-defense and don't have any idea about the self-defense, or even worse, you watch them teach self-defense techniques and you're looking at them like, if a person does that, you'll understand how they'll get hurt or how that won't work, but you have no idea because you've hyper focused only on pulling guard, going for heel hooks and doing all that kind of stuff. That tends to be a thing too. You can't negate or ignore the other sides of it. You have to, I think, equally practice the self-defense aspect of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as well as the competitive aspect, like you said, for competition, to see where you stand, to just work on new avenues of Jiu-Jitsu, because those games are out there. Those techniques are out there, and you have to know how to deal with those techniques, be it in a street fight, an MMA fight, or in a competition. So learn them both. I don't think you should push and be like, we're never going to learn anything competitive, or we're never going to learn self-defense. I think you need to have that imagery, that marriage of both of them together to be a fully well-rounded jiu-jitsu practitioner, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. That's actually one thing, because my instructor has also, he's got he coached MMA fighters, got a few guys. He got a few guys into the Strike Force in the UFC, and we got a couple of young guys fighting out here in the Dead Serious promotion. But one of the things he did to me and another guy that got the black belt same day I did, when we both got it, we were like, oh, we don't, for years we were like, yeah, I don't like training no gi. I don't like training no gi. And he was like, oh, okay. What are the days you come? And we told him those days, and he was like, okay. And then when the new year started, those days were only no gi. So he made, you know what I mean? And it was like one of those things, like, you have to do it all. Doesn't matter what your opinion is. If you're going to do it, you got to do it 100%, not just, what your preference is. That's not how life works. So it was definitely, I agree with you, what you said there. I mean, you have to, you kind of got to put your foot in all of the water, not just the parts that feel nice.
And I personally feel like another thing that, from my personal observation, and this is just, again, editorializing my opinion, another reason why I personally think that there's an older group of coaches, and I'm not talking about back to source, I'm not talking about the Gracies or anything like that, but the mid-level guys who may have received their black belts in the 2000s or in that area, that they're looking at these new young competitors who are coming out. They're better. They're trying new things. They have young bones and backs and bodies and going for inverted, crazy stuff. And they're quick to dismiss that because it might not be something that they can do. And in that capacity, it's also because they're doing that, they're negating and saying, oh, that's not practical. Well, if that kid can do it, it's practical. If he can do it to another competitor who's also doing it, it is practical. So a lot of older coaches or people will not, they won't accept that, kind of almost, they always preach check your ego at the door. But I've seen some guys that won't check their own personal ego to say, show me something new, and it's hard because I get it. From the business sense, you're trying to keep students, you're trying to build a brand, you're trying to do something. So you don't want to be the coach that loses it because your people are going to another location because they're teaching new stuff. But you have to be able to accept and say, hey, there are new techniques out there. There are absolutely new techniques out there, or riffs on old techniques that are now new again. I remember one time speaking on a social media message to Renzo Gracie, and I asked Renzo, I said, Renzo, and I called, I go, what do you think about this new jitsu? All this, and at the time, this was a few years back, so it was like the rubber guard, and Eddie Bravo was really implementing that system and really marketing and pushing it out there. Yeah. And Renzo just laughs. He's like, man, I'll tell you, I saw a guy back in the Gracie Academy back in '82 that was doing all that stuff. He's like, what's old is new. It's new as he's like, people have done these things before, and credit to like other practitioners or other systems that have branded and marketed it and put it out there and grown on it. Great. That's, it's awesome. I remember mentioning the other day, I'm like, last time Royce was here, I asked Royce, I go, Royce, what do you think about combat jiu-jitsu? We're in a seminar, and actually someone else brought it up, combat jiu-jitsu. I'm like, oh yeah, and Eddie Bravo's doing the combat jiu-jitsu thing where you could smack to the head and do that. And he just laughed. He's like, back in Japan, back in the day, there was this thing called Pancrase. And he's like, exact same rule set, and it's the exact same thing. He's like, basically, he's like, there's no, he's like, that's Pancrase. Yeah. And I was like, oh, and it's funny because I remember, Matt, you were talking about having the old Gracie and Askren DVDs. I remember my full contact fighter subscription back in the day, and ordering the Pancrase VHS tapes out of there, where it was eerie, where the entire Japanese crowd was so quiet and you could hear like every smack and hit, and I was like, this is crazy. But I was watching that and I'm like, man, that's awesome. Watching, you know, Boss and Frank Shamrock and Ken Shamrock and all those guys back in the day. And I was like, this is really cool, you know. But it's like, you know, what's old is new when it comes to concepts of jiu-jitsu and how people are rebranding and marketing. And even some with MMA, how they're remarketing and branding different things now. It's all secular. It comes back around.
I never really thought about the comparison to Pancrase, but it really is extremely similar. I covered the combat jiu-jitsu world, the first event that Eddie Bravo put on. Okay. And I had done some of his Eddie Bravo invitationals as well. I personally didn't enjoy it as much. I thought it took away from the actual art of jiu-jitsu and slowed down the submissions. I found it a little, you know, because you can't kick. So in Pancrase, the kicks were a big part of it. So I actually didn't. I went into it thinking this is going to be one of the coolest things ever, but kind of left wishing it was just the traditional Eddie Bravo tournament. But I never really thought about Pancrase, but it basically is real similar minus the kicks.
I think they said that during the brawl. You were there, so you probably didn't hear him. But I feel like I don't know. It might have been what's his name? Jeff. I was going to say Jeff Glovey. Jeff Glover. I think he was calling that, and he's like, yeah, this is like Pancrase. He said it during the first one during the broadcast. I enjoyed watching it, but like you said, I mean, I think they're trying to bring in new eyeballs like everybody else and everything now. I mean, we were talking about the karate combat. Everyone's trying to bring in something new because the UFC's on almost every weekend now, so maybe it's a little oversaturating. So I guess people are just looking for new formats and new ways to bring different combat sports to people's homes.
I saw this. Sorry. I saw this thing. I coached my jiu-jitsu team this weekend at a tournament, and it was at a big expo, and they had it there. And like where the jiu-jitsu tournament was, right next to it, there was this setup, and it was the craziest thing I saw. It was guys wearing like taekwondo kick pads and the heads and the gear, and there was like these two sticks with a string and like a gold thing on it. And the players or the competitors had like a bar, and they could toss the bar around like a soccer, like basketball or something, run down. And if they held the bar and they were close to the thing, they could like jump up and kick the bar. And it was like some like weird football soccer amalgam. And I was just sitting there, I was like, what is this? This is the coolest thing I've ever seen. You know? Yeah. It's just like you said, it's finding a way to get more eyes on a product that people are trying to push. And you know, credit where credit's due for a lot of the jiu-jitsu tournaments nowadays. I enjoy that you got guys in the submission only or these brackets or ACJ or Kasai or all these big events that are going out there that are starting to pay Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu athletes who are starting to, you know, pay these guys and get them the exposure out there for you know, for potential future transitions into MMA, for you know, sponsorship jobs. It's great because there's a lot of great athletes that just go out there and every weekend. I mean, I remember for years I ran a jiu-jitsu tournament, and I would see these athletes that would travel around weekly from state to state to just compete because they wanted to get the notoriety and get themselves out there. And it's great that there's other avenues or people saying like, we can find a way to put more eyes on these competitors to get them the notoriety so they can start, you know, supplementing and living their lives. And, you know, and that's what I respect it, you know, but to the point where the negative that a lot of people have toward it is the fact that, you know, if it does tend to water down the rules, like one of the biggest things, like I do like the submission only, because I know in certain IBJJF events I've seen guys, you know, I always laughed when you went on an advantage point for nearly sweeping somebody and you get up and you run around like, oh, I'm the best in the world. I'm like, for almost doing something where both guys sat down and did nothing.
Yeah.
So I do like where they have the submission only, where guys are having to fight for submissions. But one of the things that I love the most about like ADCC is I like how they implement penalties for guys who you know, pull guard. I miss the judo. Like all these years I trained judo and wrestling and stuff, and all of a sudden you go out there, slap hands, bump fists, and the guy sits down. I'm like, son of a bitch. You know? why was I training so hard? You know?
That happened at this past summer at Fight to Win Pro. One of the amateur MMA guys, Nate Ray, he's a really good wrestler. He's got a brown belt in jiu-jitsu, and he competed in that event. And I think it might have been the guys before him, but one of the guys before him, they did that. They slapped hands, bump fists, and the guy sat straight down, and he got booed by like the whole place because they were just like, wow, man, like really, you're not gonna. And the guy looking at him was just like, like for real, bro. And then they had to find a way to engage from there, but nobody liked it. The guy lost too. Yeah, man. I mean, it's when you started talking about leg locks, were they considered taboo when you started, or were they good to go?
So prior to that point, and kind of maybe it's my thought process, I know that leg locks were not really necessarily allowed at the time. And and now don't quote me on this 100%, but from what I was told was that I think it was like maybe the 80s and 90s, when you had an influx of the IBJJS were the Brazilian fighters, and they were doing things, and there was a lot of competition with just Brazilian fighters, that when you started getting a lot of the Sambo players and a lot of the old school kind of players coming in at that time, those Sambo guys were dropping down and going for leg locks and heel hooks. Yeah. So they eliminated that in the gi for whatever reason at the time. Like, no, we don't want to go for that. And they use the excuse of, it gets caught up in the pants and could lead to more damage. Okay, fine. So it became that transition. I started my initial martial art that I started in after I first saw the UFCs, and I didn't find a jiu-jitsu gym up in the New York area stuff at the time. When I moved down to Florida, I trained at a judo and sambo school. So I was, started learning how to do throws and leg locks and stuff like that. And I enjoyed them, even up to the point of when I got my purple belt. That was like a big, point to me. And at the time when I had got my purple belt, leg locks weren't big in the jiu-jitsu tournament scene. It was kind of like 50-50 guard was the big new thing that everybody was starting to play in the 50-50 game. And Marcelo with his X guard, that was like the big trends that were there. And I love going for leg locks and different things at the time. But not so much to the point as nowadays, and even at that point, it was always no gi. You can never do it in a gi. And a lot of guys, like a lot of the old school guys just, don't enjoy it, but it's one of those things that you have to learn it. I don't like modernly how I see guys. I have a lot of great friends who are phenomenal leg lockers, guys who put out DVDs and put it out there. But I think when I do watch certain tournaments now, and all it is 15 minutes of playing the leg lock game, and I've actually seen moments of those matches, and I'm like, wow, that guy, he put his arm there, his head was down. You could have jumped and gone to a triangle right there. Yeah. He was giving you the submission, but you were so hyper fixated on the leg locks. It tends to, you want that well-roundedness. Nowadays, modernly, I love training in a gi. Playing open guard, I love doing that. I love playing the top position. No gi, I'll go for leg locks. But I feel like you need that diversity of doing both so that you can become a better practitioner in jiu-jitsu. Don't get hyper-focused on one thing. Yeah. Look at Royce Gracie. Roger's phenomenal. His whole thing is basics and fundamentals. Yeah. He went out there. Like not many the people in the jiu-jitsu community are still like mind blown how he came back from all those years and beat Buchecha. And he was real clean bread and butter basics. And it was just like watching that match. It was incredible because you learn so much by the little nuances that he was doing. And he wasn't going for crazy open guard player. He was just going for real legitimate basic bread and butter 101 jiu-jitsu. Yeah. And he beat probably one of the best jiu-jitsu practitioners in the world after a long layoff. And I think that's important to not get so hyper-focused on the one techniques or one style, and mix it in and have a full well-rounded game.
Yeah, no, definitely. That was nice to hear. Because when I started, I remember the school I trained at wasn't my first school, and the first school I went to, there were like completely just no leg locks, and then that's when I switched over to my current instructor, who was like, yeah, they exist, so we need to do them, and that's it was a wake up call for me because we were avoiding them. So I had to learn like defend. I still really just defend them. I don't really go for them that much because of how I started, but at least I know how they feel and I know how to get away from them. You know what I mean? But yeah, it's definitely because it's the time period that you said you started, and I was just wondering if you went through the same thing I did. Because I know like there's people that talk about no white belts aren't allowed to do leg locks, so everybody would be walking around with exploded knees and stuff. So it's like a safety issue too, because some people once they learn a new move, some people just want to crank it because they don't have that control yet either. Yeah, so it's definitely it's definitely a slippery slope.
It's funny hearing Ray say that, because when I was doing my early training, when leg lock day would come around, we talked it was Sambo day. Basically, that's what Richard Hurd was. He was Sambo, and Rick Lucero knew some Sambo too. So when we do leg locks, it was like, okay, we're getting away from jiu-jitsu today and we're going to work on some Sambo techniques. So it's kind of funny how that hey, you say that, because that's basically, I mean, that was late 90s. That's basically how it was looked upon. There was the total separation, at least where I was at.
No, and it's still like that now, because early in the late 2009, 10 or so, I was living overseas, and I went to Ukraine, and it was funny. I was a purple belt at the time. I remember going to a school in Ukraine, and they were like, "Oh, we only have like blue belts and white belts here." I'm like, "Okay, I just wanted to come in and train a little, roll around a little bit." Walked into the mat, and the guy who's the instructor of the school introduces me, and he's like, "Right, take it." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" I'm like, oh, okay, I'm teaching. I'm like in another language. I don't really speak well. So I was teaching classes and doing that out there. And I noticed that everybody was really, really phenomenal at like, like when it came to their grappling movement, like their basic jiu-jitsu was a little bit like off at the time. Like I was like, oh, you really need to improve this, work on that. Their guard games weren't well. But when I was like, all right, let's roll. Let's start rolling. These guys were beasts. And they were all like, "Oh yeah, we trained judo and sambo for like forever." Like it was like, and I'm watching them go for like leg lock entries and different things. I was like, "Geez, you guys are legit," So I'm like, "Teach me that," I want to get better at that, But it's funny that a lot of people, when that leg lock game came out, it was, Matt, like you said, it was like, "Oh, that's like that catch wrestling or sambo shit," no one, that's not jujitsu. That's not jiu-jitsu. And I'm like, I think it kind of is.
Yeah.
Oswaldo Fada and his lineage were good at the straight footlocks and stuff like that. So, like, you look at guys in that sense, it's like we have jiu-jitsu players who are really good at it, so you have to implement that in your game. Like John Donner has said, why would you ignore 50% of the body? So like you have to have that mix of putting that into your game as well,
Yeah, talking about that, Danaher, what you said, that where you got the quote from the Joe Rogan podcast, I assume, right?
Yeah.
So one of the tips he gave in that was about, it's pretty much when you keep your hands inside when you're gauging somebody up here. He suggested doing the same thing with your legs when someone goes for a leg locks. I don't know if you caught that, but I've been doing that, and it works. Like, it's completely screws people up if they go for a leg, because everybody wants to, not to get dirty minded, but everybody wants to kind of scissor. So when they go for a leg lock, so if you put your leg in between their legs, it throws off whatever they thought they're the honey hole and all that stuff, clover leaves, whatever. It throws it all off. But anyway,
see, I just wanted to be cool, like roll Oleg Tektarov and do some rolling knee bars.
Oleg was probably my favorite fighter back in the days, and I was actually really lucky to meet him in Florida. He was working on a shoot here in Florida, and I got a chance to meet him. And like he's like so transitioned on to being an actor now that it's almost like it almost seemed like he forgot. Like he's like, oh yeah, I'm a fighter. I felt the same way. I was in Ukraine, and I met and it was funny because we were talking about him yesterday. I heard a funny story about him yesterday here. I met Igor Vochenchin in Ukraine, and he's like a chef who runs like this catering. He's phenomenal, and he's like well known. And one of my buddies like, yeah, of course, no one's going to tell him his food sucks because he's
knocked out. Yeah,
but dude, he's like when I met him, he was like the nicest guy, and he was all about his food. Like, oh yeah, the fighting days are so well behind me, and I was like, that guy's amazing.
You know what?
I found wrestling fighters are great.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, especially when you get to finally meet them. I got to meet what's his name with the cowboy hat? I always confuse him. I put the picture online, but anyway, towards the end of his career, he got really into jiu-jitsu. He wasn't knocking people out as much. He was jumping guard a lot and trying to do submissions. Do you remember that towards the end of Pride?
Is that what you're talking about, Don Fry?
No, I'm talking about Igor Vochenchin, because you mentioned.
Oh that. Yeah. Vochenchin started training because I remember he had like a sambo background of some sort, but he started training with. Oh,
he was kickboxing. He was pretty much a kickboxer, wasn't he?
Yeah. Most of his career, but like towards the end, like before Pride, when Pride fell, I remember he slipped down, and he was like it's like he almost forced grappling more than he tried knocking people out towards the end of Pride,
because his hands were shattered in about 19 million places.
Yeah, well, you got to evolve, right? Yeah, but when you look at jiu-jitsu, I mean, when you're watching the fights now. Like Wilson Hayes fought this past weekend at the UFC Glendale event. When you're watching as a fan and you try to, or if you do breakdowns and stuff, do you always automatically root for the jiu-jitsu guy, or do you go local?
Because I do feel, and I forgot who said the quote. It might have been Hickson or somebody who had the quote that they said that the practical use of jiu-jitsu in modern MMA, it's only like 20% practical. Well, like I feel there's a different mindset for jiu-jitsu fighters in MMA versus sport jiu-jitsu versus self-defense. I think there's a whole different mindset you have to have. And I think it's very important to have that, because in a fight, when guys are training for MMA, I'm like, don't pull guard, get off your back, top position only. Don't even go for a submission. Use your jiu-jitsu to sweep, get on top, pass a guard, and just beat them down from that point. If 10 seconds left in the fight, if in the round, if there's something, an arm up there and you could go for it, take it then, and that's it. Or if you broke your opponent and they're completely out, then go for the finish there. But other than that, like, with the exception of Damian Maia, who's phenomenal, with the exception of that, like, I personally feel like jiu-jitsu and MMA, when I see these guys who come and they're like, oh, they're old school IBJJF champions or multi-time BJJ world champs, and they go inside there, I'm like, you have to, perfect example, look at Gary Tonin. When Tonin fought his fight, he went out there, he worked on striking techniques, so he wasn't A, one-dimensional, showed a different look to the fighter, and B, down the line, like Danaher said, like his other coaches had mentioned, he's going to be able to implement back that grappling game that he's so proficient at, because he's mixing in these other techniques. I've seen, you've seen other guys in the past. I mean, perfect example, phenomenal black belt. I mean, probably one of the world's best, Salo Ribeiro. When Salo went out there in his first fight, he shot in on a guy, dropped his hands with his head exposed, caught a knee, and it was good night, Irene. I mean, it was match over. And that was, and you see like a lot of the jiu-jitsu competitors who shoot in and only feel like they only have to use jiu-jitsu at that point. You have to mix it up. You have to be able to gauge your distance, set up your strikes. Don't think about the IBJJF rule set where guys are going to do, because anything goes. This is a fight. Outside of the things that are not allowed in the unified rules of MMA, it's a straight fight. So you have to change your approach. And if only thing you have is, and gets back to what we were talking about before about watering down jiu-jitsu, because a lot of these guys come in and don't practice takedowns. It's only sit and pull a guard. So if you only go for that one style, you're probably not going to transition well into MMA. You have got to be able to mix it up, work the wrestling, work the judo, work the throws, work all that inside there, as well as your striking, as well as that. So when I watch a fight, I like to see who takes their jiu-jitsu and transitions it well into MMA, because it's not that it's a different style. I mean, it's basically self-defense jiu-jitsu, like a street fight. Protect yourself, cover up, break down posture, control your opponent, look to get out from underneath them, or control them and look to try setting up a submission, or put yourself in a position where you could start using elbows, punches, and break down your opponent from there. But first and foremost, do not worry about submissions. That's what I tell guys in here when they're doing that. My coach tells me, don't worry about submissions. Look to either get back to your feet or get to the dominant top position.
That's because I would think we said you coach MMA at the beginning, right? Or you've coached MMA fighters. Ryan Keenan was one.
Yeah, I worked with Ryan Keenan, who's one of our fighters here. Our coach, he's one of our coaches well here too. Phenomenal striker, fought in like Strikeforce and Bellator, World Series of Fighting. Awesome dude. I mean, great fighter, stuff like that. So just going to his training camps with him was awesome. Picked up a lot from our coaches, and there was always some guest coaches that kind of came along the way. So yeah, it was amazing. I mean, that's like listening to the insight from my coach John Burke, his other coach like Rob Kahn, who's another one of our coaches who's coached a lot of guys in Gracie Tampa who've been on The Ultimate Fighter and stuff. Listening to the feedback and the information they relay, it's all the same thing. Here's phenomenal black belts who are like, we're not sitting there trying to shoot for arm bars. Get out of there. Get to your feet. Get to a top position and win the fight from there. Don't hang out in the ground. In MMA, if you're on your back, you're losing the fight. So sometimes when I watch jiu-jitsu competitors go and pull a guy into guard and sit down on the ground, I'm like, well, you're already down in the judges' eyes, so you better win this right now because you're losing the fight, So you want to make sure that you're not putting yourself in a position where you do that. For MMA fighters, jiu-jitsu guys transitioning in MMA, you have to get good at wrestling, takedowns, winning the top position. Don't worry so much about the sub finish unless it is right there in front of you, and win the fight,
Ed brought up the Wilson Hayes fighting past weekend at the UFC Glendale card, and before the show ends, I want to make sure we talk about that a little bit. What was your take on the Dustin Poirier Justin Gaethje brawl of the year? I guess we'd call it. I mean, it wasn't the most technical fight, but my God, some tough bastards in there.
Yeah.
In modern MMA, to me, it's kind of it's a little bit of an enigma. There's several things that I really love about it, and there are things that bother me. I love that now it is so high profile that finally the fans who used to get old DVDs of Pride fights or early UFCs, going to like, you know, friends' houses and getting the pay-per-views back in the 90s and stuff like that. It's finally in a world market where people can appreciate it. And in that sense, I really enjoy it a lot. However, I've never been one to need to see a bloodbath. I've always wanted to see a great technical battle that if it goes back and forth and it's an even fight that ends with a knockout or a submission, that's one thing. But while a lot of people find those fights enjoyable, I personally always worry about the longevity and the end of the career for the fighters. And I think that when I see fights like that, to me personally, I feel like I've often joked around about like a guy like Gaethje is that, you know, he's on his CTE world tour. I mean, you know, I know he just recently said he has 5 more fights left in him. Yeah. And I'm like, I don't know if an athletic commission is going to approve you for 5 more fights. If you keep going out there taking the and he's taking that kind of damage throughout his career, you know, and it's like, I get it. It's exciting. The fans, it is entertainment in one aspect, but it's also, you have to look out for the safety of fighters. And while you look at that and you could applaud the grit that a fighter like that has, I personally think it's like, that's a bit, you know, a bit short-sighted. Keep your hands up, man. You got to work on that technique more, because I know it's exciting to go out there and just wing punches. And a lot of great fighters in the past, people love, you know, did that. I mean, hell, I remember loving watching Don Fry fight, what's his face, and just grab each other and punch each other in the face. That was
Takayama.
Awesome. Yeah. I love watching Cabbage Kahea get beat up inside. You know, like,
what happened to him?
I mean, I think he's probably, you know, look at guys like Gary Goodridge, those guys, he's probably in the same thing like that. You watch these fighters take that kind of abuse, and it's at some point you start worrying about that. It was an exciting fight from a novice fan perspective. It's like watching a live action Rocky fight. You know, it's like watching a movie. And at that point, there's entertainment value there. But for technique and for longevity of fighters, if that was a friend of mine or a student of mine or a fellow teammate or something, I'd be like, bro, you gotta, you know, I worry about fighters like that, because we've seen in recently, especially a lot of these older fighters, guys who've been around for 5-10 years, who've been out there actively fighting, you start seeing them take a lot of abuse toward the end of the career. And you know, unlike the other major sports that are out there, there doesn't really necessarily seem to be a retirement plan in play for a lot of these MMA fighters. And you don't want to see guys, you know, in 5-10 years, you know, in bad shape. You know, that'd be heartbreaking, you know. So while it was exciting, and I'm sure there was plenty of fans who love that rock'em sock'em style, personally, I like to see a cleaner technical fight that ends in a knockout or submission, where one fighter imposes their will and wins the battle, rather than let's see who could hit each other the most before somebody falls. You know?
For people who didn't see it, Dustin Poirier finished off Justin Gaethje by TKO in the early into the 4th round. After, I mean, each guy landed, you know, a couple hundred punches on each other's head, and Poirier's leg was swollen twice the size of his other leg. It's one of those things, you know, for being a Fox card, it's probably going to gain a lot of fans. They probably got a good amount of viewers, and people will pick up on it. But I think it was, you know, I can't remember exactly who said it, but I think it was in reference to Floyd Mayweather, and people talk about him being a boring boxer. But I was always taught the purpose of boxing wasn't to punch your opponent; it was to not get punched yourself.
Exactly.
You know, no one who never gets hit loses a boxing match. You know, if you don't get hit, you're not going to lose a fight. So it's one of those things. It's just, you know, it's a fine line between that. I find myself wondering where Gaethje's wrestling is. I've heard so much about his wrestling, and you know, when you're dazed, I think Anik or one of the guys brought it up during the broadcast when he was dazed and he was actually waving Poirier to come on and keep throwing punches. When in the past we've seen guys like Fedor or you know, a bunch of guys who will go in for the clinch and try to catch themselves. You know, realize that they're on their way out. And I always wondered, you know, with him, what would happen in some of these fights, even the Alvarez fight. Just clinch, catch your breath. You know, clear your head a little bit and show your wrestling. We've heard so much about it, but he showed so very little of it in any of his MMA bouts.
When you go back to a point we brought up earlier, talking about John Danaher on that Rogan podcast, he brought up the tenets of jiu-jitsu of your point is to take your opponent down, pass by the dangerous legs, get to a pin position, and get to the dominant position to win the fight. And you think that if this was a fight, if it wasn't a prize fight, if it was or if you're making money for winning the fight, then you want to, like you said, in boxing, take the least amount of damage as possible. So, and going back to another point, the Gracie's point is engage the clinch, get the takedown, use strikes to set up position, and then finish the fight with a submission. Or finish on the ground with strikes, put the person out. I mean, you look at Royce's original fights, that's what he did. The hands up, that old school Royce Gracie, kick, step, clinch, take a guy down. And a lot of times it wasn't all submissions. It was punches. I mean, he made Pat Smith give up on punches. He made some guys give up on punches on the ground. So it's trying to take the least amount of damage. You're never not going to take damage. I mean, even if a punch grazes off your blocking or kick goes off the thigh and you're checking it, you're still going to have a sore shin or you're going to feel that impact. Even on a takedown, when you fall down, that impact, there's still going to be some semi-damage. If it was in the octagon, it's that. If it's in a street, you're going to get abrasions or whatever, but you're trying to take minimal damage. I've never understood why, and this is one of those points where I think modernly a lot of MMA organizations want to try to have that just bleed, highlight reel, knockout, we're exciting thing and not have the technical brawlers. I mean, there was a point that was brought up for many years about Damian Maia when we talked about him earlier, that they consider him a boring fighter because what was it, like in 4 fights he only took like 2 hits or something like that? Wasn't it?
He had a good run there.
Yeah, it was something astronomically crazy like that. But that's a smart fight. He took such little damage, and he uses jiu-jitsu and won fights, And you see other guys who, not even jiu-jitsu players, you see strong wrestlers take guys down, get to the top position, sit on top of them, beat them up, Randy Couture is great at that. Get into that dirty boxing clinch, take a guy down, sit in half guard, push him up against the cage, and beat him to death. And he took minimal damage as he did it at the time, which is why he was able to keep that longevity he started late in his career, but he was able to continue fighting. But then all of a sudden people are like, no, we're not exciting enough. We're trying to be exciting. So everybody wants to be a kickboxer, and they're on the wrong end or the right end of a highlight reel knockout. Yeah. And then the longevity of fighters starts, going down. And ultimately I think it takes away from the sport because you're not seeing technically the best fighters anymore. I think you're seeing a bunch of amped up, well-conditioned brawlers go out there and fight rather than those clean, head-moving, technical fighters that we always saw. Like I think in the mid-2000s, we saw a lot of those guys come up, and now we're seeing them kind of fall off because they got older and they're out there trying to brawl now. So I'd much rather see those clean, technical, precise fighters, be it strikers, jiu-jitsu players, wrestlers, whatever, implement their game and win rather than rock 'em, sock 'em. That's always been kind of my personal opinion.
Well, I wonder if that has anything to do with the pay. Now guys aren't getting rich necessarily now, but a guy like Gaethje is making 6 figures for a fight, whereas like you mentioned in the early 2000s, if you were making $15,000 for a fight, exactly. So it wasn't necessarily worth your health, and you knew you wanted to try to come back and fight 3 weeks later. But
as far as the pay goes, I mean, you could still enforce your style that you're known for. I mean, I guess if you make the smart decisions, the only reason I'm mentioning it is because Ben Askren just came to mind. One FC paid him very well, and he pretty much wrestled. I mean, I know he's got a few TKOs on his record, whatever, but one of the reasons I heard, I don't know how true it is the UFC didn't want him because they didn't find him to be entertaining, but and Ray can tell you too, when you feel the pressure of a wrestler, there's nothing entertaining about it, but it's exhausting, and it's definitely a way to beat somebody and make him quit, and that's what he did his whole career. So
he was such a step above everybody else with his wrestling ability, though, and he had a fair share of what you would call boring matches in Bellator. His last few there, he beat the hell out of Koreshkov and. Oh gosh!
Koreshkov, the guy
and Carl Amasau. I mean, he just beat the living hell out of those guys.
Yeah, he did.
And then when he went into one, he pretty much beat the hell out of those guys. And they, he really didn't have any. I don't recall any real boring fights in ONE FC. It's just kind of he had a reputation early on, but again, that was for Bellator. That was when they were having tournaments.
Well, that's my thing too. I didn't think those fights were boring. I thought because it was him imposing his style and his discipline on his opponent. It's for me that was entertaining enough, but I know not everybody's like that.
Yeah, but when you have like your lightweight champs, Eddie Alvarez, and then you're comparing that to Ben Askren, it's but like at Bellator, it was a tournament. At least the first couple times he won tournaments where he was fighting basically like every 6 weeks, as long as he didn't get hurt, you know. And I think that might have something to do with talk about Royce. You know, he did this clinch and stuff. He had to win 3-4 fights in a night. You know, Justin Gaethje. I mean, I don't mean to pick on Justin Gaethje at all. The guy's awesome.
Yeah.
But you know, I wonder how his fighting would. I wonder how the world of MMA would be if we'd have this Rock'em Sock'em Robots. If these guys knew that the pay scale was after 2 more fights that night, when they would see that check.
Exactly.
You know, and that's why I always like tournaments, and we've talked about it before, because you always had to kind of plan for stuff. You couldn't just go all out. The guys in the early UFCs that did that, the Kevin Rozier in UFC 1, you know, he ends up just breaking his hand. You know, he ends up going down to Gordeau in the second round. But it was just, you quickly learn that you couldn't fight that way. You know, guys like Dan Severn, for example, would go in there and he would basically just slap fight everybody, but he would win championship after championship. And I you know, that's where the technique really showed. And I wonder if that's knowing that you're only going to fight once every 7 months, maybe 8 months, you know, unless you're Frankie Edgar, apparently, who they like to throw right back to the wolves after a brutal knockout.
Yeah,
but,
and that's one of those things. Like I remember watching Gaethje fight. Who did he fight? He fought Melvin Gillard on the same World Series of Fighting card that my buddy Ryan fought on, and watching this, the amount of heat that he threw on every single one of his shots, like it would just echo. The leg kicks and the punches would just and we were sitting there at first. We're like, oh, we're gonna go like get it. You know, we weren't really interested in a match because Melvin didn't make weight. You know, and
Oh, what happened? Did we lose him?
Yeah, it seems to have froze that. See if he comes back.
About the actual damage these fighters are taking, because it was just impressive watching all this. Like, oh my God, that's crazy! These shots are huge. Like you hear this, it was amazing. But then afterwards, you start thinking about, like you said, if that guy had to turn around and come back the following week to pull a cowboy and pick up a fight the next week or something, it's not possible. You know, and I think that's where the for modern MMA, I wish for a lot of the fighters the pay was different, and that scale was different, that they fought a little bit more smarter to protect themselves, or they had more financial earnings that they could, you know, obviously not have to worry about not fighting for the remainder of the year.
Do you think, Ray, do you think, just because you just touched on it when we were talking about grappling, how some guys guys get so married to leg locks they forget the other technique? Do you think, in your opinion, when the fight, because for me, talking about Justin Gaethje, I feel like he didn't forget his wrestling, but I think the fact that he finished like those fights with Luis Palomino in World Series of Fighting, when he was, and then he was dropping dudes with all these leg kicks. Do you think he just, because he even said it, I think he said it before the Poirier fight, he's like, I'm going to kick his legs off. Do you think they get married to winning in a certain way so much that they actually forget?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, look at the history of MMA. Look at the guys in UFC who all of a sudden fall in love with one thing. And next thing you know, Chuck was a phenomenal wrestler. And when he started landing that overhand right, that was it. You never saw anything else but that overhand right. You see guys who all they're going to do is that one thing that they're known for. When if they mix up, and that's the thing about the better MMA fighters, or any combat fighter at that point. You look at boxers, you look at jiu-jitsu players. In the course of a match, you have a game plan that you're trying to implement, and you have to make the adjustments necessary. And I think a lot of those fighters, it's like, if the opportunity presents itself that you set up for that thing you like to do it. However, you can't fall in love with just going for that the entire time, because Johnny Hendricks is a great example. Everybody knew he had that jab, jab, overhand, jab, jab, overhand, jab, jab. So then people started circling away from it, and he still kept throwing that. No matter, he wanted to be exciting and get the knockouts. And when people took that weapon away from him, he started fading, because, you know, notoriously he was known for not having great conditioning, I guess, and you know, but didn't utilize his wrestling either. You know, he fell in love with that one thing, and rather than mixing it up and trying to get to a clinch, take guys down and beat them up on the ground, he wanted that jab, jab, overhand. So you see fighters constantly fall in love with that one thing that they're known for. Yeah. I'm going to knock him out. I'm going to knock him out. Just go out there and win the fight however you need to, however it presents itself. You know, one
of the things I was going to ask you too about this past weekend's Glendale event, because I was watching, somebody was messaging me when I was watching Michelle Waterson's fight. What was the name of her opponent, Matt?
Courtney Casey,
against Courtney Casey. as I was watching it, I'm like, I think she has a lot of losses by submission. And I was watching her in her guard and stuff, and it's like the way she was pulling out, I was just like, she actually almost got armbarred at the end of that fight.
Yeah.
And I just feel like she's probably one of those people that she's just so in love with her being a striker, she doesn't focus enough on submission defense with the amount of losses by submission she's had and stuff like that. I don't know, when you're watching a fight like that, do you have criticisms as to how they're defending or anything like that? Like, do you think there's
absolutely, because I feel like if you look at like take jiu-jitsu and MMA and bring it down to like what is commonly the most common submissions you see out there, you're either catching arm bars, rear naked chokes, guillotine chokes on occasion, and triangle chokes on occasion. Yeah, you'll see some kimuras peppered in, some shoulder locks peppered in there, and you'll see some other odd submissions in there, but you have those basic three, things that people catch: armbar, rear naked choke, guillotines. Wrestlers shoot with their head down, they get caught in a guillotine. And it's like, guys, in wrestling, you could shoot with your head down, but you're going to MMA. There's strikes involved. You got to watch out for the knees. You got to keep your head up so you don't get caught in a choke. Rear naked choke, don't turn your back to your opponent, which I see all the time, countlessly. A lot of guys, they start getting hit, they roll over to protect themselves. And, Conor versus Nate. Nate perfectly got on him, mounted and punched him a few times. Conor rolled over, gave him the choke, and Nate was smart, jumped right on that choke right away. You see guys, or the arm bars. Countlessly, I see people inside their opponent's guards with their arms extended, standing up with their arms out there, not realizing it's like basic jiu-jitsu techniques, like understanding how to defend an armbar, how to defend a rear naked choke, how to defend like simple techniques like that. It does go unnoticed, because nowadays it isn't. Back in the day when MMA first started, you had the UFC one, as you guys both know, it was style versus style. So you had these proficient style people going inside there. Then you had the cross trainers. You had the Pat Smiths and the guys who are like, I know how to wrestle a little bit, and I could throw, no, Maury Smith, not Pat Smith. I could throw the kicks, and I could also mix up some wrestling. You had these guys starting to do the cross training thing, which is great. And now they started implementing, mixed martial arts. Nowadays, you get people who don't focus on a specific trade. If you look at it outside of like the Damian Mayas and and the Mackenzie Dern and people who came straight from a jiu-jitsu background, or Rhonda, where her judo background, or you don't have too many people that have come up who are, they came up in a mixed martial arts gym. They didn't start at a Brazilian jiu-jitsu gym and also learn how to box. They went to an MMA school, and that MMA school, depending on their MMA instructors, they're striking coaches or they're jiu-jitsu coaches, they might be proficient and they might not be addressing certain things. So they get them to be well-conditioned athletes, and they train them in just enough, but they're not experts in anything. They're jack of all trades, master of none. And you start looking at fighters, and they put themselves in those positions where I look at them like, what is this girl doing? Or what is this guy doing? Whatever. Why are you leaving your arm fully extended out there? Or understand the basic concept that they're grabbing your arm and you stand up and fully extend your arm. You're giving them what they want to do to your arm, stack them up, try to get out. And you see people and they have such a lack of understanding. And then after they tap out, they're like, yeah, I got caught. They got lucky. No, they were skilled, and you had no idea what to do. You could see people lost in those situations. And I think that's, it again gets back to that point that for me, I'd rather not see rock'em sock'em. I want to see technically skilled fighters. And I feel that fighters should kind of go back and say, hey, let me go and train. Let me go train some of these martial arts so I have a better understanding of wrestling, of judo, of jiu-jitsu, of boxing, so I'm not getting caught in these situations like I have been.
Well, she did a pretty good job of getting out of the arm bars. I thought her defense was pretty good, especially because she was fighting kind of a bigger opponent. It'd be nice to see him. I just want to make it clear, if Michelle Watterson, if you hear this podcast, I thought you had a wonderful full fight, and I'm a big fan. And
I am a big fan of Michelle Watterson too. Do not get me wrong, Michelle. You're a badass. So I'm just saying, I'm a fan. I'm an absolute fan of you. So.
No, I know. I'm just throwing a joke out there, but I would like to see the UFC bring in the 105-pound women's division. I think she'd be strong in that, and she's just a great human being. So I think she'd be a good representative for a new division.
Man, I honestly, it's so funny about MMA. They have such a struggle right now with their lower weight class divisions. I miss the WEC. I missed the WEC. I would love to see a card where you keep the heavier weights on one side and the lower weights on the other side, but equally promote them. So you can even do if you want to have the weekends, UFC, 155 and up, week 1, WEC 155 and under, or 145 and under week 2, and just go back and forth and still be able to promote those guys. I would love to see something like that again, because I miss those lightweight cards with those lightweight fighters.
What do you think about because obviously the UFC acquired WEC, they acquired Strikeforce, they acquired Pride, and then they just bring it under UFC and call it UFC. Do you think they should, like you said, the days of WEC, would you prefer that even if they owned it, they just kept the same branding as something separate just for the sake of entertainment and competition?
Personally, I would. I don't see why you would hurt that. You have a different brand. It's a completely different brand with a different form. I mean, same format, different levels of fighters. I think it's important. I think they need that diversity. I'm rooting for Bellator. I love what Bellator's doing, because I think they're doing a lot of great things with some of their fighters and how they're developing some of their young talent coming up. And I think they're doing a phenomenal job with that. UFC has some great young fighters upcoming too. I feel like with the amount of cards they have and where guys are and how injuries take place and different things, guys get lost in the shuffle. And I think it's hard to hang on to a fighter, because UFC, you start asking people, the average person, even like some skilled, like people who train and stuff like that, like who's the number 4 ranked featherweight in the men's division? Like, I don't know, like they don't know the top, because so many people get lost in the shuffles that, I wish they would have, even if WME, IMG owned, WEC and UFC, have 2 different brands running at the same time and make that a viable thing so you have more promotion for your different fighters,
I always wondered why they didn't do like a UFC Pride. Just call it UFC Pride and really focus on the Asian market.
Awesome.
Yeah, they sell the shirts and everything too. And I'm like, why didn't you do something? I think if they kept the brand and still did like they want to go to Japan. If you go to Japan, still do Pride cards then.
That would be awesome.
Yeah.
I know when the sale happened, I think there was some animosity from the Japanese fans and stuff like that maybe weren't too happy about American company purchasing Pride. But I always wondered why after it kind of died down a little bit, why they didn't just call it UFC Pride and take over the market and really get a bunch of Japanese guys into it and Chinese fighters and you could even have the Eastern Europeans really fill out those cards and then let those guys build a name, and that would be your 3 a.m. Fight Pass cards, could be every weekend from Japan or Ukraine or wherever the heck they decide to do it. But and then the WEC thing too. I keeping the lightweight guys. I thought Strikeforce did it well with their challengers cards.
Yeah,
it was you knew by the name alone, you knew that you weren't watching the top shelf fighters in the organization for the most part, but you knew you were watching the up and comers, and you weren't fooled paying $65 to get a pay-per-view with people that you weren't recognizing the names and stuff. You knew it was up and coming fighters, and from there, I mean, that's where Ronda Rousey started. I went to her first Challengers fight. I think it was Challengers 18 in Vegas, and she was coming off a couple King of the Cage fights, and but you'd heard the name from the Olympics, and it just kind of built from there. She armbarred I think Sarah D'Alio, or I think that's who it was, and you just kind of you just learned who the people were, and you knew that they were building up the ladder. So I'd love to see that come back. And like you talk about Bellator, I mean, AJ McKee just co-mained event this last Friday night, and I mean he moved to I think 11-0 now, and I mean he almost looks like a prodigy. His dad was a great fighter, Antonio McKee, and I mean his son it seems like he's just a step ahead of the other younger competition that he's fighting. So I love to see what Bellator's doing with their younger guys. You
got anybody coming out of 6 levels, your gym, that's coming up for pro MMA or amateur?
Not right now. We have some young guys. I mean, it's a different group right now. Like we don't necessarily focus too much. We have a lot of great jiu-jitsu competitors right now, like guys who are going to, I have a great youth competition team. There's a kid that I definitely think, his name is Jaden Trost. He's a young kid, green belt, 13 years old. He's tapped out like 16-year-old kids in tournaments. He's, he's really like a kid that I feel in the next couple of years might start being on that jiu-jitsu radar. We have a young guy here, and one of our coaches named Baron Pitts, who's a phenomenal jiu-jitsu competitor, has won some decent tournaments, has competed against some big names and won in the past. And I know he's taking like a year or so off, but he's, you know, looking to get back into it actively. That he's a guy definitely in BJJ. Definitely, I feel he's going to make some noise. Whether or not he decides to transition over to MMA later on, I don't know. But yeah, right now it's like, it's been funny. I think that, like, I don't know, and I'll even ask you guys, like, your perception of it. Like, do you think, like, modernly, I don't know if there's a lot of like young MMA guys who aren't already out there who are coming up right now. Like, I feel like that market where fighters or people, because I knew like a lot of guys who were playing football or other sports, when they started realizing that their shelf life was ending on that, even if they weren't going to get into college, or they weren't going to get into the pros from college, they were like, you know what, let me try MMA. And I feel like a lot of guys now are starting to kind of steer away from that. I do see a bigger rise being in the jiu-jitsu community and the tournament out there, in the tournament scene, where I start seeing a lot of now younger, like the tournaments are building up really big, where you start seeing a lot of those guys. Maybe they're afraid of getting hit. I don't know. maybe it's a different mindset, but I see that being a trend right now, or they're trying to become proficient to make that transition over. But I don't know. What do you guys think? Is that something that you guys are noticing a lot of upcoming young talents, or?
I mean, around here, from what I noticed from the guys I've trained with and the other people I talk to up here in the Northeast, I'm actually noticing there's more guys, that younger guys, especially when they come in and they start at a jiu-jitsu academy or an MMA school or Muay Thai gym, and they want to transition into MMA right off the bat. And then as they spend time, a lot of them are just like, I think I want to compete in, you know, like the Fight to Win Pro or these, because now that there's more of them. Because back again, but if I go back to date myself, you know, when I did it, there was only Naga and Grappler's Quest, and that was it.
Yeah.
And IBJJF. But you know, then you know, all these other ones. Now you have New Breed, you have because like you said, Kasai's the big one around here, right? And that happens right where I go drinking. That's why I don't go cover it, because it's too close to all the bars I like in Brooklyn. But yeah, no, it's definitely, there seems to be more places where people now can compete and make money doing it, even if you're not that well known. So,
you know, when you talk about like football players and other athletes transitioning into it, I think that's harder to do now. You've got kids that have been training MMA since they were 6 years old now. So you know, for these guys to jump into a gym, they're not necessarily the best athlete in the gym anymore.
Exactly.
So they're coming in, and you know, you had the football player who was just a tough guy, you know, and he, okay, I'm going to come in here, and I got some wrestling. I wrestled a little bit in high school, and now they're coming in there and they're running into the guys that have been training strictly MMA for, you know, they're 22 years old and already have 15 years of MMA training. I think that's the huge difference that I notice, is that, you know, it's so many more guys now who are just have a lifetime of training, and it's just harder for somebody to step into a gym and really make a name for yourself unless you have that history and that background.
I think you do see that too. Getting back to like talking about earlier when we mentioned Nicky Ryan, you 16 years old beating black belt adults, you know, and like you mentioned, I've seen it here with our youth program. There's some kids that I've been teaching since they were 7 years old who are now getting ready to turn 14. And I mean, if you consider an adult to get a black belt in jiu-jitsu for an adult, it's an average of anywhere from as little as about 7 years, as much as 12 years, give or take-ish, you know, depending on what you do. So if you go 7 to 12 years to get a black belt, and then you take a kid who started when they're 8 years old and they're now 15 years old, they've had that same 7 years and they're learning and they're constantly practicing and training. Now they're almost like, well, outside of like not having adult size and strength, you're beating guys, or you have just the same amount of training. And for the kids, their parents are like, this is an after school thing. So they will be there 4 or 5 days a week training, you know, no excuses, because we need to put them somewhere. So unlike adults who might come in 1 or 2 days a week for that amount of time. So these kids are constantly training. So I think, to your speak point, exactly. I agree that I think that there's a lot of athletes that come in and see like, wow, I'm strong, I'm fast, I'm whatever, but this kid's got the technique and he's putting the numbers on me. And I think it does start deterring people. But it's funny. I think that like MMA, the entrance into MMA is now it's an ebb and flow. And I think my opinion is I see it kind of in a downslide right now, because I see even in Florida's got phenomenal jiu-jitsu schools. our sister academy, the Gracie Tampa schools out there, Rob Kahn, Matt Arroyo, who was in the Ultimate Fighter, fought in UFC, and then now is a phenomenal competition grappler. They have tons of guys who are fighting MMA. They're up-and-coming young guys, but they have a lot of guys who are in the sport jiu-jitsu scene, no-gi, submission grappling, and they're beasts. They're killing it out there. American Top Team, Wagner's here, and at his school down here. There's a lot of great schools. Ruben Alvarez. There's a lot of phenomenal competitors out here that when you start looking at jiu-jitsu, I think a lot of guys who used to fight MMA are now starting to get into, like you said, I can get paid to grapple now. I can go out there. I've seen some tournaments where they have a super fight. They pay a guy $500 to do a 10-minute match. So in 10 minutes, I can go make $500. And that match might end in a minute with me getting submitted or that guy getting submitted. One way or the other, we're both getting paid. So then it's like I made $500 for a minute's worth of work. Thank you, goodbye. I could do that this weekend, and then next weekend I could do the same thing again. And every weekend I could go out there and do that. Make $2,000 in a month for literally just doing maybe if you add up the time, if it goes to the full time, 10, 20, 40 minutes worth of work. Make $2,000 for that, as well as my teaching, as well as my gym thing. So I think a lot of guys are saying, man, rather than go out there and get punched in the face and getting injured and whatever, I can do this and it's less impact for now. But then all of a sudden when they get that credibility behind them, they're like, you know what, let me make that transition. Let me go in there and try to fight and do something different. So I think that, for me, I see MMA is kind of in a down slope for now, but I do think that I don't know what's going to happen with the UFC. There seems to be a lot of weirdness in that company right now, per se. But and I think Bellator's doing a lot of good things, and I think other organizations are doing good things. I feel there's going to be an upswing later with athletes or fighters going to different areas. Whatever's going to happen with the whole fighter union thing and that kind of stuff like that. I think there's going to be an influx in the next couple of years where it's going to maybe become more legitimate as a sport with like retirement plans for fighters, and guys will consider jumping and staying and doing that again.
Well, man, Ray, you've been a great guest, and I know we're starting to run short on time here, but a couple things. I would like to hear some of your picks for some of the upcoming fights. Okay. This weekend for the UFC Atlantic City card, Frankie Edgar, Cub Swanson.
It's always hard to pick against Frankie. And normally I would pick him. I feel like just because of that short timetable off that knockout, his first knockout, I feel like if Cub plays it smart and picks and sticks and gets out of the way, I feel Cub's going to decision him in this one.
Edson Barbosa, Kevin Lee, the main event.
Barbosa. I just think his leg kicks, he's a beast. And Lee's aggressive. He's one of those guys that I think is not really a specialist, but is a good athlete. And I feel like Barbosa is going to beat him there. I think he's gonna pick him apart.
Yeah, that's one of those ones where I wonder if Kevin Lee, if he's going to come out and use his wrestling, and kind of follow the Khabib playbook, or if he's going to let the Rock'em Sock'em Robots thing get into his head there. And then one last but not least, in 2 weeks we got the big Fedor Frank Mir fight. How do you see that one?
Oh yeah, man, I've such. Frank Mir gets a lot of crap from people, but he's always been one of my favorite fighters. Because I just think a big jiu-jitsu guy is always great, and Fedor is probably if Fedor isn't in everybody's top 3 fighters of all time, I don't know what the hell they're watching. But I actually am going to have to go with Frank Mir on that one. I just think that Fedor has taken a lot of. He should have always been a 185er, a 205er at least, and I think that, going against a big guy like Frank, we've seen Frank, if Frank fights like he did when he fought against, when he kind of went on that renaissance of his again, I think, he'll do well. If he strikes and moves and uses his wrestling and grappling, I think he can out grapple Fedor. I don't know if he'll submit him, but I think that Frank Mir, he's a bigger opponent. I think he definitely can, I think he's going to pull out a decision win on this one. As much as that breaks my heart to say. I mean, I like them both, but I do like Fedor a little more. I think Frank Mir is going to win that one. I think this on size. He's if he fights smart, then we'll see.
And Matt just unfriended you for saying that.
Matt, I'm a huge Fedor fan. I tried finding his gym because he has an associate gym in Ukraine. It was a Red Devil gym out there as well too. So I was out there. I was like, I just want to see. I was like, is Fedor here? It was like I remember watching him. Oh God, the fight that he. unfortunately lost to Verdum. I was watching that in Ukraine, and all these guys like Emelianenko, they're all cheering for that. And when he lost, it was like quiet, and I was just like, what's about to happen right now? So I mean, yeah, he's an awesome guy. I love Fedor, but I'm gonna go. It's kind of a pick 'em, but I think Frank is going to be able to out grapple him.
No, I mean, it makes sense. Everything you're saying makes perfect sense. And, you know, my whole thing is the size difference. You know, Frank Mir's huge. You know, I know he's in good shape right now, but I ran into him, I don't know, 6 months ago in Vegas or something for at a comedy show. And the guy's a monster, you know, and if he uses his submission, I think if he stands for the fight, I think he could run into trouble because I think Fedor will have speed on him. And, you know, Fedor seems to be throwing a little bit more straight punches than he had in the past. At least the one he landed on Mitrione was a straight shot. So if he stays disciplined, I think he's got a good chance of beating him. But I just hope, like I said last week, I just hope they both come in shape and put on a good show and you know, nobody suffers a severe injury, basically. You know, to end their careers. But well, God, it's been a great show, man. I think we could talk probably for hours. Anything you want to promote or throw out your Twitter handle or any sponsors?
Yeah, man. Unfortunately, no sponsors right now. Back in my music days, I would have had a ton of sponsors. But, you know, 6 Levels Orlando, that's our academy. If anybody comes to the Orlando area, please stop on by. Come train with us. You know, jiu-jitsu, MMA, striking. You know, we do it all here. Self-defense, tactical jiu-jitsu. It's an awesome gym. You know, just keep a lookout for that. Yeah, my Twitter handle at @BaseGJJ Ray. It's the same as my Instagram handle. Follow me on the MMA community. I'm Rhino there in the MMA community, so you know, come check me out there. For all those guys in the MMA community that are listening, thank you for listening. I know there's some great people in that community. A couple of goofs. I don't know, some guys, this dude from Miami, I don't know what's his deal. I think it's like Donald Trump nut hugger or something like that. I can't remember his name, but he's a character. That guy's he's always talking about wanting to come up and train against me. I always invite him, but you know, never know if he's going to come. But
well, if that ever happens, we're streaming that live on the Combat Hour. That's for damn sure.
I want my points. I want my pay-per-view points.
I still say it's the best. It's the best. I mean, that's how we all got together again. The MMAcommunity.com, it's still the best forum for that sport on the internet.
Absolutely.
So even Donald Trump nut hugger aside.
Awesome. Guys, thank you so very much. I'm really honored. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Absolutely. I just want to remind everybody they can follow us on @CombatHour on Twitter, myself at MMAHawk21 on Twitter and Instagram, and @Carbazal on Twitter. Thanks everybody that listened. Ray, great guest. Maybe we'll do this again in the near future. Sounds like we got a lot we can talk about.
Awesome. Thank you guys. Appreciate it. All right.